All right. I'll start getting started here and just welcome everyone and thank you for joining the Start Speaker Series for October. We're really excited to have John Boakye Danquah here today to present for us. I'll first just acknowledge that I am here on Treaty 6 territory in the homeland of the Métis, and that as we are gathering, we are paying respects to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place. So that's just my land acknowledgement. And a few of us were just chatting about where we are kind of right now in the world. So feel free to share that in the chat, just anyone who's joining now. Feel free to introduce yourselves as well in the chat as we get started here for the day. Awesome. So I'll introduce John here. Um, John is an interdisciplinary. Oh, sorry, I'll prove that first. Sorry, John. So, John is an interdisciplinary social science researcher whose research focuses on environmental governance, social and cumulative impact assessment, and advancing justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion within scientific research and the natural resource sectors. John's career has spanned roles in federal and municipal governments, academia, and nonprofit sectors across Canada, Japan, and Ghana, providing him with a broad perspective on global and local challenges. As a research social planner with the City of Calgary, John supports the design, implementation, and reporting of social research across different teams. John is also an adjunct professor at the University of Saskatchewan School of Environment and Sustainability and a sessional instructor at McMaster University's Academic Sustainability Program, where he contributes to educating and mentoring future sustainability leaders. Today, John is going to be presenting on myths, resistance, and challenges to advancing social equity in organizational and scientific contexts, and the implications for doing transdisciplinary work. So, John, I will pass it off to you.
Okay, good morning, wherever you are, and welcome to our presentation for today. And so my name again, once again, is John Boakye Danquah, and I'm going to share my screen right now so I can start. Well, I planned this presentation just for context. I'm currently in Calgary, and for those of you who have been following the news, I planned this without this thing was planned earlier, but along the line, the kids, I have two little ones who are home, but they have been home for quite a while. And just today, they all started school. So it kind of unsettled me a little bit, but I'm really excited that they are back to school and life can go on as normal. So can you confirm that you can see my screen?
Right now, you'll just want to switch presenter mode so
Oh,
we
okay,
can see the notes. That's all.
sure. Let me do that again. Um, yeah. Can you,
Perfect.
can you see now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, and welcome everyone once again. And so I have titled my conversation today, Transdisciplinary Pathways for Social Equity. And I am going to really look at lessons and narratives of myths, resistance, and barriers based on my own experiences that I've worked in government, academic, and nonprofit context. And so a lot of what I'm going to share is mostly around stories and narratives. And the expectation is that I'll reflect on these things and what does that mean for people who do transdisciplinary work, depending on how time takes us. And so, although I work in many roles, today I'm here specifically speaking as a Transact EDI coordinator, and therefore, what I'm going to say does not reflect the other places that I work. It's just for the research that I do. Now, I wanted to start this conversation with this movie title that is on the screen, Miss Chatterjee versus Norway. I'm not sure how many of you have watched this. It's on Netflix. Show of hands, how many of us have probably per chance watch this movie? Anyone? No one. Okay. Well, I highly recommend that to you. But so just for context purposes, so what the movie is about is that this is an Indian mother that is living in Norway, whose two children were removed by Norway's child welfare services. And then she had to battle for custody for the kids after social officials cited neglect for behaviors common in Indian households, like hand feeding, children sleeping in the same bed, and others. So it took her over 13 months to resolve the issue. Now, why am I starting and why is this very important? It indicates that equity is very important in the way that we whether in research or the way that we do public work. And the case really show how neutral child protection rules can privilege majority culture. And then also language barriers. Another thing that came up in the movies around language barriers, excluding the mother from decision making and legal processes because of language barriers. But at a much higher level, it sits at the intersection of gender, race, ethnicity, migration status, and class layer. And these really work together to affect how authorities perceive her competence as a mother. And so yeah, it's a very important case that shows that. So and just so that you know that in the context of Norway, you have 37% of 9,900 children removed from their parents placed in foster care in Norway by the end of 2021 came from immigrant homes. And so that is telling. And so that is really set a context for our conversation today around why it is important that we look at equity and why it is important that we look at that in the context that we live in. So within science, within policy, within organizations, we all do know that there are several persistent inequities that pervade and that we know. And I am going to go through just a little bit of that in terms of some of the things that we see and know about the inequities that we have. Historically, if you look at the history of science as an enterprise, there is enough evidence that demonstrates that it has supported gender, identity, and racial inequities. Several examples of systemic exclusion of women from clinical research, racist human subject research, organized medicine's role in racial discrimination, pathologizing LGBTQ plus identities, race science, the eugenics. So there are a lot of examples of these things in history. And these things are still very important. They are ongoing. The consequence for a lot of knowledge and trust, although most of these things have been resolved, but the consequences are still very there. And so it is very important that we understand this history if we want to be in this space. Secondly, in addition to the fact that these institutions have pervaded, it has also allowed science institutions and other institutions have allowed discrimination, harassment, and personal harm of racialized persons and women to continue. So there are widespread cases of sexual harassment that are widespread in academic setting, and mostly when they tend to come up, they are mishandled. They don't really handle them quite very well. And we know that field science has been a hotspot for harassment and assault. And in addition to that, research culture is mostly characterized by unhealthy competition. There's a lot of bullying, there's a lot of harassment that happens. And these things tend to disproportionately harm women and minority groups. And it is important that this ongoing, there's also a lot of ongoing harm to indigenous communities via university museums. And so these are examples of a lot of museums in the States that still holds a lot of native remains. And you can imagine that being a native indigenous and working in this environment, knowing that these things are still there for research, but they are still there. So why are these historical patterns of inequality, identity, racial inequality still very important today? And how does that matter for the work that we do as transdisciplinary scholars? First, they undermine trust and legitimacy in science. Because if this history is there and they've not been addressed, people are really very worried in terms of how they engage with scientists and whether they trust the science that comes. Again, they also leave structural legacy that still shape who participate in science because they created barriers and opportunity for others. So it then defines what counts as knowledge, right? So that is really very important why we still need to talk about that. They affect the relevance and the equity of knowledge produced, and they create barriers for meaningful participation and collaboration, especially when you have all these institutional things still very present. And but at a much higher level, they also provide lessons and pathways for change. And so it is important that we know what has happened so that we and acknowledge these things so that we can path a way forward. And I really like this quote by James Baldwin that talks about the fact that not everything that is faced can be changed, right? We need to face our past. It doesn't necessarily mean that facing the past means that we're going to change that. But nothing can be changed until it is faced. So it's important that we face the past irrespective of how uncomfortable that past history is, it's important that we face that in the context of the work that we do. Now, it is not just a past issue. I think there's still a lot of inequities that still persist along disciplines, along gender, along geography, along ethnicity, race, social class, language, and others. And so it's not just the history. I've talked about the exclusion part, the harassment, the microaggressions, devaluation of work as well is also a very key thing that has been reported in the literature, being researchers being under-resourced, and the lack of data about visible minority populations in the way that we collect them, in the way that we use them for clinical trials and others, and that affects the success of the work that we do. So it is still something that is really very with us. It's not just a historical, although the forms, the magnitude, and the nature may have changed, but there are still a lot of inequity that still persists. Now, I said that not to mean that nothing is being done. Now, a lot is being done to address these inequities. And the work that I've done mostly in the natural resource sectors, we've seen that the natural resource sector across government, the private sector, professional societies, and in educational institutions, this lack of equity and representation in society is widely acknowledged. We know that. And they've seen a lot of attempts to address that. Common approaches include equity hiring, development of diversity and inclusion statement and policies. We do talk about collection and analysis of diversity data, training on EDI. These things are quite common these days. EDI into racism training, and then requirement for scientists to demonstrate how they address EDI in science if you're applying for a grant or something. So these sort of commitments or these sort of efforts to address inequity in science is mostly driven by multiple motivations. We can talk about the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, specifically Goal 5, that is on gender equality, and then Goal 10 on inequality between and across nations. So here we can look at within, internally, but also the global north and south divide that we have. There are also very large-scale social and political changes that are happening. You can talk about the Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter, the George Floyd issues, and the enduring impact of COVID. That really highlighted that those who were really impacted were people that were from minority groups and from low socioeconomic backgrounds. So these are large-scale motivations that is driving the work around equity in general. However, in the last 2-3 years, we've seen a lot of attack on generally the effort to address equity. So these are examples of a lot of, so either universities are rolling back, government agencies are rolling back, corporations are rolling back, and that is coming up in many places, mostly driven by what is happening in the States. But there's a lot of attack on all the progress that has been made. And so it's affecting all facets of society. And so these are all examples of things that I just saw on the line in terms of what is happening. But in our own context, so it is quite important that we still, in the context of all this is happening, the rollback that is happening, we need to remind ourselves of how far we are changing as a society. And here, I just want to limit ourselves to the Canadian context here. And if you look at the last Canadian survey, the census survey, a key thing that really comes up is the fact that Canadian society is really changing. It talks about a rich portrait of Canada's religious and ethno-cultural diversity. The key thing that came out of the survey is that our society is significantly immigrant population. There's a significant growth of racialized groups and the increasing prevalence of those with no religious affiliation. So Canadians top more than 450 ethnic or cultural origins are reported in the Canadian population. That is really very huge. That is very huge. So with this knowledge about what has happened in the past and the attempt that was made to address that, but also the current clawbacks and the rollback of what is happening, but also knowing that our society is changing, especially for people that work in frontline services and look at data. We know our society is changing. So how do we work in this space? And how does this changing demographics impact the way organizations serve and deliver services, the way that we teach, the way that we do research? How does that impact the way that we do work? Now, I want to talk about that a little bit. But before I do that, I just want to talk about really my own journey and the lens through which I use to look at these sort of things. And the first thing that I want to talk about is really where I have come from in terms of my own spatial and cultural, the things that have influenced me, and how that informs the way that I look at these life skill things that are happening. So I am originally from Ghana in West Africa. I did geography. And so from that perspective, mostly when you're looking at it from global north and south, there are a lot of issues around things that are concerned that mostly researchers from the global south are quite concerned about. And I've worked with a lot of researchers in the global south around some of the inequalities that really persist, especially when you are working with north-south research collaborators. I've also been studied in Japan as well, and the nature and the culture around work, around relationship, around language, and the things that work in the way that have influenced me, and also working in the University of Saskatchewan as well. So all these things have really shaped the kind of things that I value, the kind of things that I prioritize, and what is really important to me. And some of them might come up as well. But not just the places that I've been, but also the people that I've worked with. So on the left here are people really in academia, or my supervisors, mentors, and other people that I've worked with, not just in environment, but also in business, schools, in forestry, in other places here in Canada, but also in the global south in Ghana, as well in Germany, but also other students that I've mentored here as well. And then on the far right side of my screen are people that have worked either in government or in non-profit. So I say this just to say that these are people that have really influenced and shaped the approach to which I come with these sort of things. And I've been very humbling to learn from all these people and the experiences that come with it in many different spaces. Finally, I also just want to highlight the fact that the research that I've done have also really, the priorities and locations have really cut across the globe in many different spaces and places. I say that in a very humbling way, but just really talk about the fact that how I relate and talk about these things. Some of my work have revolved around forestry, small-scale forestry, climate change, cities and flooding, but also mining, post-mining landscape, mining around socioeconomic impact. Now I talk about critical minerals as well. There's also a work that I've done around equity or inequality in science that I did work on. So these are the things that have really shaped me, and these are the lens through which I come with the work that I do. Now, in reflecting on all these experiences and the background that I've come, I use a reflective approach as a way to have this conversation. And why is reflectivity very important? It is a way to build empowerment, and it's a way to really, as an empowerment to change the practice. So reflection is really very important. It sits at the intersection of research field as a learning method, but also aimed at governing the mind, right? How do you de-govern the mind, especially if you work in systems that are oppressive? So reflection is really very important. And the task is really around how do you unmask these hegemonic assumptions that infuse the context of life, how do you disrupt reproductive systems of gender, class, and tyranny that we work in. And as a way to reflect, it then offers a pathway to reconstruct the possibility to challenge the structural power relations that work, but at a very interpersonal level. And as a person, therefore, it allows me to give more moral stance to exercise liberty, empowerment, and transformation, as opposed to being just a mere intellectual to reflecting on what I do. So critical reflection is really empowering because it releases you from different governing forces and allows you then to change your living conditions and improve the practice. And so that is the approach to which I want to talk about these things. Now, in reflection, there are three ways that we can go about it. First, in sequentially, so I'll talk about what is the issue? What are the incidents? What are the experiences? About who, about what, why, when, and where? I might not go into all that, but I talk about the what first, and so what, right? Once I talk about the what, so what? How do I make sense of all those experiences that have happened? And then now, how then do I make connections from the experience and then for further action? So the what the what, and then the now when is the way that I want to frame these conversations. Next, so in terms of what I plan to do, I'll be doing two main things: deconstructing some myths and resistance and challenges that have come up in the work. And so one of them first may be to unpack the myths and misconceptions that sometimes cloud our thinking in this space. And then secondly, diagnose the resistance that stalls progress. And then depending on time and conversation, we can then look at how do we embrace transdisciplinary mindset as a pathway to address these resistance and myths that we have. So first, what are some of the myths that I've come across, that I've heard, that I've experienced, but also others? So in talking about these things, I'm talking about things that I've experienced, that the people that I've worked with have experienced. So it's not just about my story, but also the story of others that I've worked with in this space. So the first thing that I want to talk is a myth of neutrality, or what we call the color blind or identity blind fallacy, or the myth of equal access. And this has come up in many forms, based on either in a research context or in a programming context, where people say that we serve everyone, we don't discriminate, right? And we are equal service providers as well. Our doors are open to everyone. It comes out quite very well. And finally, we have invited them to our meetings, but they didn't show up. So these things are things that I said, on the surface, they are well meant, right? Our doors are open, we are equal service providers. These are very great sort of statement. On the surface, they sound very fair. But this mindset is one of the biggest barriers to advancing equity. And why do I say so? First, we know that treating everyone the same isn't the same as ensuring that everyone has what they need to succeed. Because we know that not we all don't start from the same level. And therefore, saying that you treat everyone the same does not really, it's really not the most valid statement to make. And again, we know that neutral policies can mask individual barriers, as we know. They can't do mask individual barriers. And doors may be open, but reaching them can be hard because there may be barriers for others. Others may need ways to open the door. The door may be open, but not everyone can enter. And finally, invitation is not alone, is not participation. So sometimes when we hear some of these narratives and talk, it is very important that we subject them to scrutiny. For instance, there will be barriers around English being the only form of language that we know, in terms of how physical location might be accessed, transit costs, lack of wheelchair access, absence of these things we know, and over time they are being addressed. But it is important that we look at this kind of very common statement that is often made, and why, although it might be well intentioned, it might not necessarily address the core of what we are talking about here in terms of equity. The second myth that really comes up is the idea of what I call the scientific neutrality. And so here, there have been instances of work that I've done where people say, well, my work or my research is not discriminatory by design. And so because they might be working with groups that are minority groups or that are, and so they might say our work is inherently advances equity, right? Because you might be working with minority groups or indigenous community and other things, that is really the mindset to which they define the work and say that the work is not discriminatory by design or it inherently advances equity. Now that is really very important. It is quite seductive for scientists and for academics because we are trained to believe that in our own objectivity, but it can be a major roadblock. Why? Because it ignores the sociology of knowledge. Because research questions really do not emerge in a vacuum. They are chosen by people, they are funded by institutions, and they are really shaped by our priorities. So whose question get asked? So even when your research is not discriminated by design, sometimes it is very important that in a group that may be minority group, there might still be people that are much more oppressed. So it's at the surface, it doesn't address the issue of intersectionality. It's very important. And it is only when you go deeper that these things might come out, right? It's also very important that we look at this, and the design phase is really very important. And so it's important that we look at the social processes that governs research. And it's not enough to say that your research is not discriminated by design because you focus on groups that are already oppressed. Third, there is a lot of things that I've heard around what we call the compliance or the procedural myth. And so here, people default and they hide under bigger institutional frameworks and say that we follow the policies of the organization, either the HR or the practices or the collective bargaining agreement, so we can't be discriminatory, right? So that is what the organization has set. These are the processes that they have. And so this is a myth that frequently comes up in large institutions, and you hear this statement quite very often. It's a very stubborn kind of statement because it uses the organization's own rule book. This is what we do as a way to shield against critique. Because if you critique people, they might say that okay, we are following the institution's policy, right? And so at a very high level, what it seeks to do is that it mistakes the minimum for maximum. So here you are looking at legal and policy compliance as a bare minimum, as a starting line, not a finish line. But I think it's important we need to move beyond that and to think about the fact that equity is really about excellence. It's about going above and beyond what is legally required to create what is truly just and effective, right? Such a statement doesn't really address, or it ignores the gap between what is on paper and what is in practice, because that can be very different. Because a good policy, for all its intents, implementation is done by people. They might bring their own biases to the table. And therefore, the way that we hide under these sort of policies might not be the way to go if you want to work in these spaces. So it's very important that we look at. And it, in some sense, first of all, we call it a very passive culture, culture of passivity, because it allows people to say, my hands are tied. I can't do anything. Really, our hands really tied in most cases, or are we just abdicating responsibility and judgment to policy, which policy might not necessarily really address, and in some cases we might have to be very careful the way that we address things that way. So compliance is about following rules, but equity is really about doing what is right, and in most cases they don't align, right? So it is not the same thing. So it's important that we address this. The fourth myth that have come up in my work that I've seen, that others have talked about sometimes when you question them, is really the technical exemption myth. And so here statements such as, our or my research is not focused on human subjects, but on ecological issues or highly technical subjects, right? And therefore, I don't have to address equity. There are no equity considerations in my work. My work is based on computer or online simulation. It is based on large-scale analysis with no direct contact with communities or indigenous communities. And my work is computer modeling. And therefore, there is little or no opportunity for engagement with communities. And indeed, it is very so that a lot of work happens in this space as well, right? So we hear these things quite as well. But what it seeks to do is that it creates some sort of a false dichotomy between human subject and research and everything else. And then it then therefore grants a false free pass to ethics, right? It mistakes the tools for impact because saying this thing does not it really doesn't talk about, it's just talking about the tool. It is not talking about the people that you work with, right? Because there are people who are going to do this kind of work. Just because you use computer doesn't mean your work doesn't affect people. All these kinds of work are going to affect people. The output of models that we have will be based on policy decisions. It will be used to allocate resources, regulate so many other things, prioritize interventions. Some of them might be health related. So those decisions have human consequences, although they might be computer, they might be kind of ecological issues and all that. They might have human implications. So it's very important that and we also do know that the choices that we make, where to make, how we make our models, they do affect who is at the table as well. So it's very important this kind of mindset where we externalize the harm, right? We allow scientists to believe that there is no negative consequences to things that they cannot see. So there are no unforeseen side effects. But research that is ecological, whether computer modeling or whatever, at the end of the day, may be used to make decisions that might affect people. So it is important that even right from the onset, we think about how the end product might affect people as well. Fourth myth here is really, I think I'm sure a lot of people might be familiar with this as well, the myth of identity or blind fairness. So this is where we talk about we don't look at people or applicant names, mostly nature-related settings, or maybe in admissions that we do. And I've heard statements like, so on the equity side of things, we just approach everyone the same. I don't see differences. We hire the best people for the work. We don't discriminate. These are really quite very common things that comes up. So they might sound that the ultimate form of fairness, right? We don't look at people's names blind so that we are approaching the same way. But in reality, it is one of the biggest barriers to achieving true equity. Why? Because in most cases, it confuses good intention for good outcome. And those are very different. You might have very good intention. To be blind to difference is noble, but the impact is that we become blind to systemic inequity. We become blind to systemic inequity when we do this. We fail to see that the playing field is not the same. We don't know, we all don't start the same. And therefore, equality at the end of the day, at the most basic level, is about giving everyone the same pair of shoes. It's not really so equality, that's what equality seeks to do. Just one brush, paint all people the same. But equity is about making sure that everyone can reach the finish line. They are not the same, the goals are very different, right? The goals are very different. So this on the surface might really sound very good, but the implications can be quite very dire in the way that it works. The last and the last one that I'm going to talk about is really uh, the question of externalizing of responsibility. But before I do that, I think even with this one of the key things that we really need to think about is that, especially when people say, I don't see any differences, it is really not evidence of fairness, right? It's evidence of failure to look at that. Because on what basis, what data, what information are you using to do that? Because if you are not collecting data and you are not disaggregating the data to find out who is being left behind, there is no way that you can see the problem and fix that. So unless that you have done that due diligence of really looking at the data, the information to see that people are not being left behind. But in most cases, it doesn't really happen. So saying that we don't look at people, we don't on the equity side, everyone is approached the same way. It's really, really very problematic. And it doesn't in any way, at the core of the SDGs, as we all know, is the principle of leaving no one behind. And therefore, it is only data that can help us to really disaggregate and see who we are leaving behind. And that then provides opportunity to see how we can fix the problem. So the sixth one is really what we call externalization of responsibility. So here, how does that happen? It comes up in where there are some fields that people say there's a low diversity in trained or skilled workforce for recruitment. Like the talent pool in our field isn't very diverse. I don't find people who are there simply aren't enough qualified candidates from minority background to recruit. So that is really a statement that comes up quite very well. So there are some fields that are really, if you see those fields, it's not very diverse. And these are some of the statements or the justifications that are given for people not being there. And so it's quite very pervasive. And at the core of it is that it halts progress before it even begins, right? So it's because we do know that whilst we know that there are a lot of historical inequities that have shaped many of these fields, but it is not ideal to use them as an excuse and for a failure of strategy of imagination. So what really can you do, right? As a researcher, someone in your field who you find that there are not enough people in that field, is there a way, is the easiest way to say that we don't have them? Or can you be very conscious in the way that you want to bridge that gap by specifically recruiting from those groups to see how that can be done, right? So it treats the pipeline as a natural thing. It's a natural force. That is what the market. So it's default to the market dynamics. We are not getting people from that. Like it's a system that was built that way. And therefore, how then do you address that? It is important that to address it, we need a different approach. You cannot take the same normal recruitment approach when you are dealing with a field where you don't have a lot of people who you might consider as not being in that field. So you need quite a completely different approach, right? It is not enough to just blame the system and say that that is what the market demands and therefore you are just doing the bare minimum. You are not discriminating. It requires that you go a little bit further beyond that. So that is really the key thing that really comes out. So really in that context, equity is really around sourcing building relationship with non-traditional talent, resources, and being willing to look for potential, not just perfect on paper credentials. It requires you to go beyond that. And it's very important that we do that in the way that we look at these things. So I've talked about the first part, which is really around the myths. In the second part of this conversation, I'm going to talk about really some of the barriers, resistance that stalls some of the progress that we have. So now we've talked about the myths, so let's then turn to real world barriers that stalls progress. And the very first one that I want to highlight is really what we call the institutional readiness gap. A lot of researchers, a lot of organizations, people who man this research might say we have insufficient institutional support. So you question them, why are you not considering this thing? Why have you not thought about this? Oh, we don't have the support that we need. We don't have clear direction of what the equity goal is, right? What is the direction from top management, from the organization? We do not have that. So they create what we call that vicious cycle of inaction because you are looking defaulting to authority, and as long as that is not coming, you are not, there is less that you can do. So, and people might talk about the fact that there might not be staff that might be trained in that area, or there might be budget for that. There might be failure from leadership to do those kind of work. So it becomes something like voluntary for people who really want to do it. And therefore, in most cases, you might find people that are overworked working in these spaces, right? So, but at the core of it is that it's more screened for really people not wanting to do the work. When people are waiting for organizations to really have clear directions and mandates. Because in most cases, even when there are clear mandates that come from the organization, that might differ based on the work that you do. So you really have to look at the nature of your work and ask yourself, what is it that we can do to address inequities and reduce barriers and gaps, even when there are no clear direction that comes from the top? Because it is not a blanket one-way approach to address equity. It depends on the kind of work, the context, and the place. While it is helpful to have that direction, it is not an excuse not to do that work. So we don't need perfect goals, we don't need perfect directions. We just need a good starting point. Where do we start? Where are the low-hanging fruit? Where are the minimum barriers that we can start to do, right? So it's important that we do that. And these are things that comes up quite very well and that have come up in many of the work that I've done. There is also a bit of what we call generational mismatch in priority and socialization. And there are a lot of teams that I've had in conversations, whether in academia or outside academia, where there's a generational gap where we have young people who really, because of the time that they live in, they are really passionate, they really understand and they see the inequities they want to work on. But then you have other generational groups who are not cut for these things. So statement like we have some old people on our team who don't see the value of this and they pose some resistance. It's quite very, it comes up as well. So that generational sort of gap is also there. And it can be a barrier because those who might be there for a long time might hold the power, and therefore you might hold a lot of resistance when you try to do that kind of work. On the third pillar, we also see what we call the fear of measurement barrier. The fear of measurement barrier, and that comes up in many forms. It might either be we don't collect personal data, and so this specifically speaks to the issue of using data, specifically disaggregated data, to understand and to pinpoint inequities, gaps, and people that are being left behind. But a lot of organizations say, well, our policy does not allow us to collect personal data. And I've been with groups that were working in this space, and one of the things that they needed is data, employee data, to be able to analyze the data to see where the gaps are. And they were working on a project, and that was just about 2 years. They spent over a year trying to assess employee data so that they can do the analysis, and that data never came. So without that data to build a baseline understanding of who is here for how long, who's getting promotion, who's not getting promotion, who's coming in and leaving, it is kind of very difficult to build any strategy. There is also what we call lack of consistent approach to collect and disaggregated data. There might be organizations that are collecting the data, but there's no consistent approach to collecting that data and disaggregating it. In some cases, there is even a fear of collecting that data. People don't want to do that. There's a fear because it is not a culture, or they've not built a lot of rapport and support with communities, and therefore they don't even know how to ask these questions. But without without data, living in this data vacuum, there is very little in some cases that you can do, right? Without data, equity work is very difficult. You cannot really diagnose what the challenge is because you need the data to really tell you exactly where the work is. It might all be around guesswork that you do, and therefore, whatever strategies, policies that you put in place might be is less likely to be very effective, right? And although there might be privacy concerns that are there, there might be identity issues that are there. I think for a long time we have really moved, and there are safeguards that are available to make sure that you don't cross these ethical boundaries and you don't really harm people by identifying their information. And so it is not enough to use this as a way to say that because of privacy concerns, we are not collecting that data. We have come a long way and we know how to treat those data so that we don't violate confidentiality. There are ways to anonymize the data, to aggregate the data so that you can identify patterns without really revealing people. So there are standard practice for doing that. And therefore, it is not enough to really say this, right? But even when it takes a long time to even get the data, those are areas where you have a lot of bureaucratic resistance to data collection and sharing responsibility. That is quite very common. And it is mostly a symptom of a lot of the institutions that we have, which are not really committed to a lot of transparency. And it's just a way of maintaining and denying that these inequities exist. Therefore, they may not be willing to share that data. So that is very important that we look at this as well. I am coming to really the last. How are we doing with time? I cannot see my time here.
It's about 9:45 or in Saskatoon at least. So, yeah, if
Okay,
you want
sure.
to, yeah.
So the last, I hope is the last one that I'm going to talk about is really what we call the silo wall barriers. And this has come up. I've personally experienced that where people question me, okay, you are trying to do my work. And this is around infighting and disagreement and competition between groups and teams that are doing different kinds of equity work, right? There might be teams that may be doing indigenous related work, anti-racism work, equity related work. And in some cases, because of these, the way that our institutions are built, there might be, in some cases, has occurred a lot of what we call very disheartening within the same community, but it comes up as well between infighting, competition between different groups, competing initiatives, competing for funding, which really, really, really is really not helpful. And it is really the greatest gift to the status quo because for those who don't want the system to change, I think really when they see these things, then it is really the fact that, okay, well, you can't get anything done if the people who are supposed to do this work are infighting. So when leadership provides insufficient resources or very lack of clear strategy around how to create this kind of work, it creates this kind of what we call scarcity mindset because these different groups are all competing for the same resources. They might all be well intentioned. They might all fighting for the same thing because they want the work to be done, but it doesn't really move the work if you are spending most of your time arguing and having conversations around how you can get the work done. So this siloing is really not very helpful, but unfortunately it does happen, and I've seen that happening as well. There is also what we call the institutional readiness gap. Okay, the title might be wrong, but one of the things that I've seen come up is really sometimes people who are even identify as minority and other groups, and you're asking them how they are addressing the work that they do. And then you ask you, why are you asking me these kinds of questions around equity and black or brown, right? Because they feel that because they are of the identity, naturally they do that kind of work. But it doesn't automatically work that way. You need the tools, the resources, the skills to be able to do it. The lived experience might be very helpful, but it's not enough to have the lived experiences to do the work. But I've seen this come up as well. And then the final thing is what we call the advocate's dilemma. The advocate, there are a lot of people have worked in this space, and there are people who work in this space whose roles are temporary, non-unionized, and therefore it is very difficult there's a lot of risk involved in that because how much can you push, right? How much can you push for the work to be done? And would that impact on your, because this is a very, you might be in a very precarious kind of employment situation. So the challenge of not knowing how much can be pushed to advance equity in the work that you do, it is also quite something that really comes up as well. So it is a concern, and you really have to calculate daily in terms of what can you do, how much can you push, and all that. And I don't think that is really very helpful if you are working in a space like this that comes a lot of trauma, a lot of draining, but yet you are not very secure, and therefore you are always calculating the steps and the risk that you take. Now, I just want to just spend a few minutes just to talk about this, and because I just want to also have a little time to talk about all this, because so there will not be a lot of time to reflect on really embracing this kind of work. So essentially, based on all that I've said, essentially what we're trying to do is to solve these are very complex problems, right? With disconnected solutions and approaches where you have technical teams that see human issues outside their scope, where HR and other groups see equity as just a compliance issue, right? Leadership sees it as a separate initiative, not a core strategy. So, in most cases, based on all that I've said, we see what we are treating symptoms and not the system. And I talk about these three pillars of resistance, about myths of neutrality, structural barriers, and then these internal visions that we have. So it is important that based on all these things, we need then to have kind of a mindset of transdisciplinarity because it's more than just collaboration. It is a way of knowing, doing, and co-creating solution with communities, not just for them. And it is not just about inviting people to meeting, it is about co-designing, meeting purposes, rules, and coming together to have a conversation. I really want to leave the conversation here, and I don't want to really preempt what really is next to do. But based on all that I've said, just to really force you to really think about some of the systems and structures and challenges that happen, and therefore, when we encounter them, how then should we? What should be our approach to the way that we do this work when we encounter them? It therefore requires that as people who work in this space, who care and work in this space, you need to really build yourself. You need to really be very intentional and be aware of all these gaps, all this resistance, all these myths that are very common. Being aware then provides you the opportunity to develop how do you confront them when they come up. Is really very common. So for me personally, these are things that I am working to find solutions to. How do they come up? How do you confront them? And how do you be an advocate in a space where these challenges are there? And what does that mean for the communities, for the groups, for the people that you work in this space? And how do you build a work that really requires that we don't do a lot, we don't do harm, but we are more interested in the solutions. If our focus and the priority is on solutions, we are more willing and accommodating to bring people together, to work with others, and to make sure that we care. At the end of the day, it's all about care. If you really care, our approach, our solutions, our tools that we use tend to change. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, John. We do have a little bit of time for some, yes, and thank you for the clapping. We do have a little bit of time for some questions. So please feel free to unmute and yeah, ask a question to John. And then if you want, you can also share it in the chat and I can read that out. So I'll just give everyone a second um, to think about that or to have a question. Michaela, I see you there.
Hi, John.
Hi.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I loved it. And I love the framing of like the myths and categorizing some of like classic responses, like go-to things that I think people do really unconsciously. I thought that was so helpful. So, thank you. I know that you talked about this from an organizational perspective, and I'm wondering at like kind of in an interpersonal context when you're talking to someone and you see these like strategies being deferred to or like these kind of various types of defensiveness come up, do you have like a go-to line or like way like an invitation kind of that you feel like is effective in getting past those defenses and prompting some kind of reflexivity that's not happening clearly when people jump to those things.
Thank you, Michaela. That's a very important question, and I've grappled with that a little bit. And so in the organizational context, what has happened is that, and so there's a blend between sometimes this kind of work, you are working in these sort of organizational sort of context, but it's also become quite personal because we engage with people quite a lot. And therefore, what I've seen come up is that, especially when people take these stance, the worst thing that you can do is to sometimes push. The worst thing that you can do is sometimes push. And so what I've done in most cases, because of the work that I do, is the use of data. The use of data. I find that because sometimes people think that in a lot of these conversations, they are talking point that we use around equity, and sometimes it's not really backed a lot by data, because people might say that, okay, everyone is saying that, and therefore we don't really go to the meat of it and really surface the structural issues, the evidence, people's lived experiences that are really very common. So either we use narrative stories about real experience that people are going through, or data to really have the conversation. And I've seen that that really works in most cases. There's a lot of instances where organizations mandate people to do training. It has shown that training really, in some cases, does not work. It makes people who are opposed to these things even much more angrier. And so having these conversations using narratives and stories of people going through and surfacing data that shows systemic inequities that really exist that people cannot challenge is what I've seen work. Even in interpersonal circumstances where I've seen that work. It's there might be different approach, but based on what the work that I do and the instances that I've seen, it is mostly around these sort of stories, live experiences, and also sometimes even drawing our own experiences, our own stories to really highlight the conversation, and then using data as well.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much. I was thinking about that. I think you did mention this, like tying it to systemic and structural, like so to depersonalize it, because I think
Yeah,
so often people are doing like, but I'm a good person. And then you're like,
exactly.
okay, well now we can't even have the conversation.
It's not about you, right?
Yeah,
So
exactly.
in most cases, when you talk about this, people feel that you are attacking them, but it's
Yeah,
really not about you. You might have but you work within a structured system that really constrains you. So let's have a conversation around that. It's not really about you. Yeah.
thank you.
Felicitas, please go ahead.
Adjunct, thank you for a very informative presentation. I enjoyed it and I learned a lot. And as I'm even wondering whether I should ask the question, I actually have a two-part question. The first one has to do as I'm assuming that a lot of us here, we are researchers, whether we are student researchers or whether we are working researchers. And I was just wondering, you know, I was just wondering about advice, especially for someone entering in this space, about how we can show up into these spaces and to contribute to transdisciplinary research that is informative and empowering. And then I also wanted to hear your comment, and whether there's such a thing as someone who goes into this with blinkers on when they're minority.
Yeah, no one is immune from from these things. So I don't think there is any being a minority being that's I mean as I've said, the example that I gave about someone saying, why are you asking me these questions? This was a conversation in an interview. We're trying to understand, so how are you working with your team? How are you, what are the equity issues or inequities that exist in your work? And the person was shocked while we were asking that question because, oh, I'm this, and therefore you don't have to ask me these questions. But so I think on a very personal level, how do we approach this kind of work? For me, I think it's all about being very humble and being very aware. Being very aware. I think awareness is very key. And I wish that sometimes even the history of itself, because as a researcher, it is important that in your own field, you need to really be aware of what is the history of the field, what is the extent of equity or inequity in the field, and what are some of the things that are coming up. I think for many people, we assume that we know what the issues are, and therefore the approach that we use may not be really the most effective because we assume that we know. But I think it requires that we all need to do a lot of learning on learning. And for me, I think that is really the key thing. If you really genuine care, you want to work in this space, a lot of learning personal, spending time by yourself trying to understand in your own field what are the key barriers, what are the key historical things that are there. And in some cases, when you're engaging in groups, your ability to really tell those stories, being aware of those narratives, being aware of those history might be a way to build bridges with communities. So I think it's very important that we do that self exercise of ourselves. I think in most cases the best way to really show that you care to really build bridges with communities and to really start a conversation. The history, the current narrative of what is happening, and being very aware and talking about them as a way to have conversation is sometimes the way to go.
Thank you. We have time for, I think, one more question, if anyone has that. I did have a quick one of just because you talked about working right around the world. And so I'm wondering how different places that you worked, like, are there differences in how each place approaches like this conversation, right? And if you could speak a little bit on
Yeah,
that, like how when we're coming together, how do we work together if we're all coming from potentially very different definitions even or places, right? So
yeah. I think that's a very important question, and I've seen uh, that what we different countries, different places are at different stages in the journey around why these things are very important. Although these are global issues, but I think different places are in different journeys, and therefore sometimes it is important that we know where people are and the journey that they are in. But also, if we are leaders in our own area, if we are the ones that are bringing the groups together, we have a duty and responsibility, irrespective of where the journey that different groups are in, to really set the standards in terms of what is the minimum that's required in this space. Because I know that I did a bit of work, paper that I wrote with some scholars from the global uh, south around experiences of inequality in North-South research collaborations. And in these conversations, all that was talked about was really around some of the inequities in North-South collaborations. But in the South, there are a lot of inequities in the workshop that also came about. That is, it is not written. No one is talking about them. And all that we talk about is the North-South, the high level sort of inequities. But there are things around students' supervisor relationships, they are around gender issues that are really quite very common and that are taken for granted that are there. And so I think we also have a duty when we engage with other groups that may not be in the journey where we are to really set the standard and say that this is how things are done. And this is where we can be, recognizing that it might not be the same in your own space, but I think we have a duty to carry people along, and the way that we do it and the approach that we do that matters. Not that we are enforcing, but creating this as a general good, and that helps everyone to work in the space as well.
thank you. Awesome. So I just want to thank you again, John, for giving this presentation and for joining us today. It was a very wonderful and informative presentation. And then thank you as well to everyone who joined for today's October Speaker Series. So that is, yeah, the end for today. And this will be posted also on the Transx YouTube page. So if there was anything that you missed and you wanted to go back and view, you will be able to view that there. So thank you again, John, and I hope everyone has a good rest of your day.
Thank you.